So thanks, everybody. As said, my name is Kurt Cordes. I am with my own little consulting company called Enigmatic Global, but also doing a postgrad cert in tertiary teaching and learning at University of Waikato. And I'm just going to jump right into it. A couple of prefaces first, though. You notice the question mark on the end of the statement. It is really a question mark. I am still looking and seeing whether this is a thing or not. Also, I will be moving pretty quickly because I want to get through it because I'm really interested in getting comments from all of you as well, because this is part of the whole thing that I'm doing, is looking out there and seeing what's out there. So just as a start about me, originally I am born and raised Canadian. My parents are from the Caribbean, and the pathways to the Caribbean were from Portugal, from Western Africa, and from Northern India. So I am pretty global. They all collided in the Caribbean, and then my parents immigrated to Canada. So I was born in Calgary, raised around the Toronto area. But fortunately, I was able to spend about 10 years after I graduated university in my other country of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and on the small island of Bequia, which is about 9 square miles surrounded by water. And hopefully you can see from the frame, it's quite nice. And spent the time there. And obviously water is a big part of what goes on in Bequia. So the sailing days, all bets are off, schools close because it's one of those important days where everybody's there. People are fishing, making their living on the water. A lot of people go away and work on cargo boats, on cruise ships, and there's a lot of ferry traffic moving between the islands. So you're constantly around and on the water. And to the point where it almost becomes part of who you are. So I would be taking the ferry often over to the mainland, and it can get rough. I mean, it's not a nice, quiet voyage sometimes. And we'd all be sitting on the bridge up on the front of the boat. The green boat is the one we actually take. And every so often, somebody would see a wave out of the corner of their eye, and in unison, everybody on the bridge immediately reaches out and grabs something because we know what's coming. Everybody from the school kids right up to the older adults can read the water. It's part of who we are. So that's carried with me over the years. And I spent a lot of time down in the Caribbean, scuba diving instruction, sailing skipper. That's where a lot of my teaching background came from and continued on as I went forward. So if I was to say what my professional journey is, it's been a combination of aquatics, adventure education, water safety type stuff, but also actual teaching with teaching English to speakers of other languages, curriculum development, all of those kind of fun things as well. Now I'm in the diversity and inclusion realm, but really that whole idea of education, but experiential education has been a part of who I am. So I've brought that to New Zealand when I immigrated about 5 years ago. And one of the projects I'm doing right now is called something called Global Swim, which is specifically for diversity and inclusion in aquatics. And the program that I teach is a little bit different. You'll see on that picture, I'm doing a lot of different things. So I have dry classroom settings, done some scuba stuff, different ways of actually engaging people with the message of water safety. And one big resounding thing from the very first class right up until I'm working with professionals is that idea of understanding the water, respect the water, and the sense of community. And that's the core of the program, and that comes through in everything that's being done. It's a narrative that pervades the entire thing. A quick move to the drowning stats in New Zealand. You look at that chart, the red line is about 2006. And as you can see, there's been shifting before that, and now it's kind of stabilized, except for that little light blue line, which is the hospitalizations, which have gone up quite significantly. So there hasn't been a lot of movement in the past 15 years, and the water safety realm has recognized that, and they're starting to change what they're doing. But I start to look at that and go, how do I help move the needle? And also, why am I building the things in that I'm building into my programs? And is there a gap? So that's when I stumbled across this term called transformative learning. And I'll say quite plainly that when it was explained to me, I went, hey, wait a second, I might have been doing that for the past 30 years. Because in outdoor education and all these other things we do what seems to be a lot of that. And I won't explain it to you right now because I know all of you, quite a lot of you are educators and probably know about these things. But I'll explain how I interpret it. And I think it's Ted Fleming, a researcher, was doing a lecture, and he explained it in this way. And there are a bunch of file cabinets in your head, and you have your skills and your knowledge that goes into those file cabinets. The transformative learning comes in how those interact, what you think is important, and it's the machine of making meaning of all that that is the transformative part and where transformative learning lies. So again, it's something that I think I've kind of been doing, and I very much wanted to get more into it and understand more about it. And I looked at water safety and went, wait a second, maybe we're missing something here. So in general, as I was coming up in water safety, and I can say as a kid, I didn't really like swimming lessons because it's very skills oriented. It's you will do this, and this gets you to be able to do this, and then we assume that you're going to be safer in the water. And lately, they've gone to a more competence model. So they're really thinking more about, is somebody competent in the water? Can they actually handle a situation? And that's the 15 competencies that Drowning Prevention Auckland uses right now. But there's another layer. So this is a picture that I use when I'm doing my dry workshops. And you see that wave coming. And what's really interesting is not so much me using that wave to say, hey, water's powerful, but the reactions of the room when they see that wave. And I have groups that have no idea what's coming until the water actually hits those two people. I have other rooms who way out in the distance at the very beginning of that wave, they're gasped. It's a visceral reaction of, oh no, those guys are in trouble. That kind of understanding, that kind of knowledge. My thing is, how do we get there? Can we actually design programs that prepare people to better accept that kind of knowledge later on? And would that make people safer? So for example, this is from the RNLI up in the UK, a cartoon that they did, but the thing of floating. Now you can teach somebody to float, they can float effectively, and that could be the end of the game. What I'm normally doing, especially when I'm working with adults, there's a narrative behind it. So you're describing what's happening when you're floating. You're saying your body will not sink. Your body is designed to float. And once they float in the shallow, you immediately move them to the deep end so they understand that whether it's deep or shallow, it doesn't matter. Your body's going to float. What I've found is that kind of switches a switch in the head where suddenly it's not a panic situation if you're in the deep water because you know you can float the same way you can in the shallow water. That kind of understanding, are we building it into programs? So I thought, okay, let's make a hypothesis. If transformative learning would be helpful in water safety, let's look at it more closely and see what it's about. So the idea is reducing drowning and helping communities, but also the opportunity to go do a deep dive in transformative learning, and that's for myself because I'm really interested in that field and the practical applications of that. And what I'm doing is using an exploration model. So if you go to the old IDEO, Design Thinking for Educators, I still hold on to that from many years ago when I found it. And the idea of discovery or exploration, to look at the fringes and really look at what's out there, covering that target. So I'm really looking high, low, and wide. And down the rabbit hole I go. So I very quickly found out that transformative learning is very deep, and there's a whole bunch of literature on it, right back to Dr. Jack Mesereau and other models. So I'm starting to look at that. The idea of threshold concepts has popped up several times. The idea of triple loop learning has popped up, and those are things I need to look at more deeply. Prescriptive learning versus process-oriented and adaptive. That's something that was coined by Dr. Chad Hogan. And I'm looking at that very closely because that's the idea of, are we telling people what they need to learn, or do we have an end goal, or are we just guiding their learning? And in something like this with water safety, it's kind of a double-edged sword because we can actually lead people down a path instead of having them empowered of their own learning. Outdoor education, experiential education, all part of it. There are things from my background as a sailor and scuba diver, how I learned and actually applying some of that. Water competence in adults, some stuff is coming out in that. Natural environment, swimming pool. So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, which is kind of on the fringes of all this, looking at this idea. Dr. Chad Hogan, again, has actually looked more closely into typology of transformative learning, and I'm thinking about using this model to look at water safety. And without getting into the whole thing, the two critical categories, the idea of depth, that your transformative learning has some depth to it and some lasting effect, and also the breadth of it, that it doesn't just do what you're prescribing, but also affects other things in your psyche, that it changes the way you think about life in general. And if you look at water safety and your relationship with water, if we look beyond water safety, there are elements of that. Water connects us. Water is part of who we are. So the idea of the Waipuna model, which is the Maori-specific model, the Maori framework for water safety, which is now part of the national strategy, that was developed by Dr. Chanel Phillips. And looking at that, and are there parallels in this? And looking at an Indigenous point of view of water on the element of transformative learning. One of my experiences up in Maine when I was doing open water swim rescue, I was told quite plainly by some of the rescuers that you can have two fishermen that completely hate each other. But if there's a problem and one of those fishermen are in trouble, all bets are off, and a fisherman will risk their life, risk their boat, risk their livelihood to go and get that person that they hate. That's something powerful, and that's something real, and that comes from a relationship with the water. Water can flow, water can crash. The idea that there's wisdom all over the world which draws from water and the power of water and how water affects us. And for me, again, for my program, the idea of understanding, respect, and community, the idea that community, this is one of my messages in the program, you are part of the community. It doesn't matter how long you've been here. It doesn't matter what you're doing. That's important. So that gives you a nutshell of where I'm going with all this and whether we can actually start to look at transformative learning as something important in water safety. But I'll end with something a little bit wider, and this is my Turtle Power logo, so tertiary teaching and learning. But I see a lot of parallels for myself in my experience with tertiary teaching and learning. We've gone from focusing on skills and knowledge to looking at competencies and growing competencies in people. Do we need to go the step further? And not in an individual way, but a systemic way. How can we change the system to start looking at guiding transformative learning? And that is me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kurt.
And I'm hoping I'm in time.
Yeah, no, good time. Done well. So that's a really interesting look at some different models and theories that you're exploring and discovering. And we are kind of, I appreciate the roots of what you've pointed to, like Mesero is one of the kind of foundational sort of educational theorists in lots of ways. And you mentioned threshold concepts as part of your kind of matrix of theoretical frameworks that you're working through. Do you, how do you see threshold concepts applying in your particular field?
So I would go back to that floating situation where the actual act of floating or the skill of floating doesn't necessarily mean that the person can navigate floating in the situation. So arming them with the fact that you're not going to sink, that critical reflection and coming to the point that this is how my body acts in the water. That's what I would call a threshold concept. And again, I'm completely new, so I'm diving deeper to see whether it actually is. But in my rudimentary sense, I would call that a threshold concept, where once you understand that, once you get that, the rest of the learning becomes easier. Because you now have the concept that, hey, this is what the water does to me. This is how my body reacts in the water. If I'm in rough water, it doesn't matter because I'm not going to sink. If the water's deep, a hand isn't going to reach up and pull me down. You know? And panic is the number one issue. It's not your skill level. It's panic. You can have somebody who's very skilled in the water. They get caught in a fast rip. They're disempowered. They don't know what to do. They might drown, even though they can swim. So that aspect of building these competencies, or not competencies, that's the wrong word, ideas and concepts.
Yeah, no, that's such a great example, I think, because you've got that whole business of you're teaching someone how to float at that superficial level doesn't actually give them that meta knowledge that this is what can happen in any water circumstance. And all of this stuff, I guess, Kurt, is so important for us here in New Zealand because we're a water country. We've got lakes and rivers and sea, and we've got this huge coastline. So everybody needs to know these skills that you're teaching. And I think that that's something that the government is also starting to kind of come back around to. Is your program funded through government grants, or is it privately funded?
Slowly but surely. It's definitely not privately funded, because the clientele that I work with, it's more engagement with communities. So it really is reaching out and making relationships and kind of joining the two sides. The work that I do right now is funded by Water Safety New Zealand in part. The local council here in Tauranga is also funding part of it. And I'm also looking for other opportunities in that respect, but small ship, I'm kind of steaming forward. But also just to clarify, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, it's not that I'm the only one that's talking about it, but systemically in New Zealand, in water safety and aquatics, this is something that is a conversation to be had.
Yes, it's back to that transformative idea, isn't it? That you can teach at a very sort of instrumental level certain skills, but unless people get their heads around it, then it's always going to be that superficial thing. And as you say, that can disappear in a moment when they're caught in a rip at the beach or something. Like I know how to float doesn't cut it, where I can float anywhere is actually the transformative part of that concept.
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our time. I can't see any other questions in the chat box. Has anybody else got any?
We've probably got. I mean, I've actually got a bit of a question.
Okay.
Kurt, because let's say some of the things that you talked about in terms of that, getting into threshold concepts, and some of how you described things made me think of zone of proximal development, that idea that when somebody's got a bit of, they need to have a bit of knowledge before they can move on to the next thing. But
right.
Then you moved on and you started talking about trust. And I can see, let's say, I see trust as being really important in all parts of education. But when you were talking about trust, were you seeing that as being trust just between the learner and the teacher, or trust within that whole community? Because you talked, or you brought in community a few times into, let's say, how you were describing things. Is that, is it one-to-one, or is it many to many?
So interesting. I'm trying to track back because my brain just kind of threw everything out there.
Yeah.
But with what you're talking about, that you're exactly right. There's trust on two sides. One is the trust in community and the idea that I belong to this community, I should help my fellow person, just on that level. And the other thing, there is an element of trust in this kind of delivery where if you do have the trust of the group, or you do have trust of the person you're working with, you can push them farther. You can, because they have to believe that you're telling them something that's real. They have to have some trust that you have the knowledge that you're saying that this is important. So I found in my programs that trust has been a huge factor in me delivering from beginning to end. I'll deliver the dry program first, and people who normally wouldn't have gone into the water will then decide to go into the water because, hey, I know you now, which for many communities, that's an element of importance even culturally, is for them to have met the person, know who the person is, had some interaction. Now I'm going to kind of buy in to what you're saying, whereas I wouldn't before.
Cool. Thank you very much, Kurt.
No, thank you.